So I've got a PowerPoint presentation that will run through a number of different segments, and this is titled Evolution of Air Borders, 75 Years of Facilitation. A number of folks have facilitation in their background or customs in particular, but I'll run through some of the thinking associated with where we see the different aspects of this. And also very much thank Borders and Globalization and Emmanuel for the continued opportunity for collaboration in terms of the summer institutes that I have participated in for the past couple of years. So the title for the presentation is very much geared around the year of facilitation. And for folks who are familiar working with the International Civil Aviation Organization associated with Annex 9, this is described as ICAO's 5 objectives for facilitation. A lot will work collaboratively with World Customs Organization, among other global bodies. But the 5 objectives are outlined as operational efficiency, economic prosperity, robust border security, elevated passenger experience, capacity enhancement. And so this is the year marking the 75th anniversary for being able to look at the evolution since 1949 in terms of some of the standards and recommended practices impacting civil aviation. And a good example for this is what the Gulf Cooperation Council is working on. So on the left-hand side, you see the map of the 6 countries that are represented in terms of the GCC. And this year, under the 75th anniversary of ICAO, GCC is unveiling a single grand tourist visa to unify travel for the 6 countries. Now, if you've ever spent time in that part of the world, definitely will understand that there is sometimes an uneasy relationship between the 6 countries represented. Qatar was under blockade for a number of years. And so the rivalry between different countries doesn't undercut from having a single point of interface for a common interest for developing and co-developing tourism from geographies outside the region that you see on this map. But there are many other examples in terms of what Southeast Asian countries are doing, among others, for which I'll come back to this a little bit more later around the role of global organizations like ICAO, as well as multilateral in terms of regional bodies. But let's go back to our storyline. If you were having this conversation 100 years ago, this is a picture of what a document would have looked like for folks from my own ancestry. So my parents came from Hong Kong and immigrated over to Canada in 1974. But 100 years ago, you would be at a point where this particular document was really geared towards the head tax and also prohibition from Chinese individuals from immigrating to Canada. 75 years ago, as I mentioned, was when the Annex 9 was adopted in terms of the way the narrative advanced ahead. 1949 had 89 different practices. The last edition in 2022 had 442 standards and recommended practices. 50 years ago, as I mentioned, that's when my parents came over from Hong Kong. And so I look at now, 2024, how does our story in terms of the evolution of history evolve? A number of countries represented on this call, Argentina, Peru, Canada, Italy. Otherwise, we are in a rapidly changing geopolitical dynamic. And this is something that's important to understand. So what you're looking at is last year, the United States and Korea signed a major agreement in terms of looking at additional research, data sharing, among other kinds of things that would be advanced between South Korea and the United States. Earlier this year, a similar announcement between United States and Finland. And finally, the other aspect as it deals with air borders is a motivation associated with expanding visa-free entry to 93 countries from Thailand. That was a decision this week to be able to provide additional visitation. So one of the themes I'm going to go back to as I go through the remarks is just remember those five objectives for ICAO for facilitation, and one of them is resulted is as a result of economic development, and in this case for Thailand, as it was with Sri Lanka as well, in terms of similar types of moves to create an additional ability for visa-free entry to be able to facilitate more tourism. So who am I? I've been active on US-Canada borders since 1997. And for our friends here from Canada Border Services Agency, I also date back to the point in time when there was a separate immigration and CCRA group. And so I've been active working on technological transformation on borders since 1997. Some of the areas you will find me writing about is a lot on biometrics. I have a paper coming forward on blockchain that will be published this year around distributed ledger technologies and what they could actually be used for smart contracts as well as supply chain management. Coordination and interoperability come into a lot of the work I do, as well as regulatory change, where there may be regulations that do not anticipate the kinds of things that will be possible with technologies, especially to define and manage risks. As Emmanuel mentioned, I lead a global consulting firm that does a lot of work in market development and some of the areas that I'm going to speak about. But before we get too far, let's continue the historic journey a little bit more. For those of you who've had the chance to travel through Canada, this is a picture of Pier 21 in Halifax. It's on the opposite side of the of Victoria in terms of the Atlantic side, but you can also find a number of other places like Hamburg, Germany, among others, where you can find immigration or emigration museums. So being able to look back from 1912 in terms of the picture of immigration to Canada, you can see that dominant flow from UK, continental Europe in 50 years ago, a dramatically different shift in terms of a much greater flow from South America, Asia. And it's critical in terms of looking at the evolution of flows that when you deal with the subject of immigration, movement of people for temporary journeys such as tourism, to be able to just have that context for the kinds of changes and flows that have occurred. There are three parts to the presentation today. One, I'm going to run through the fundamentals of border risk management. I see a lot of folks who are practitioners already day to day and at operational or supply chain level. So I'll try to make sure we link to some of those aspects, but it'll be a bit broader in terms of the overall fundamentals. Number two, as I mentioned, bilateral relationships between countries or multilateral in terms of being able to look at different borders. Those are some aspects for which there are a lot of different thought processes that are part of the evolution. And then finally, the third part will be some aspects on aviation security and looking at, well, we've had 75 years of global standards and practices. What next in terms of 2024 and beyond? At around just under 2 hours from now, We'll find a logical break just to make sure that folks who are both online and in person at UVic you get a little bit of chance for a break. But we'll also have a practicum in the last 45 minutes of our schedule to be able to have a small exercise that will take some of the things that I'm going to talk about in practice, and that will go back to the actual nature of what the ICAO's 5 objectives are for the 75th anniversary of the facilitation term being coined to the journey map for passengers. So I'll take that through to small groups to be able to be divided up in a breakout session. As I mentioned before, have had a lot of work in a range of different things over the past 27 years associated with different forms of border evolution. And what I've found, of course, in terms of some of the possibilities are also how do you actually find the alignment between what an airport is, where it's evolved to be, as well as the product life cycle for different ways of managing risk. Before we go too far, and for historians in the room, it's also important before we go too far to look at what does border history look like in practice. So the next slides deals with, well, how do we actually think about borders? There's a lot written about borders being fixed points in time, but in fact, there's a lot more that we can say about the temporal aspects of borders, meaning by the time you apply for a visa, that might actually be the start of a border process. Anders Kundberg has in 2018 put a very amazing infographic associated with tracking every single border ever put in place and has concluded that based on the map, most borders are just less than 200 years old. So remember the narrative, I went back starting 100 years, 75, 50. Well, it's not much further beyond the history in terms of the age of borders. Now, unfortunately, viewing the map in terms of crediting Anders' work, the website does not have that map online anymore, but definitely worth finding in terms of internet history. But I'll go through some of the highlights in terms of Anders' work. The oldest border on the planet, and understanding we're defining borders in the sense of being able to demark a line in the sand, so to speak. That is in the Andorra's mountain, 120-kilometer border between France and Spain, the year 1278. So this is defined as old as the remaining border. So of course, borders have changed over time. And this is a concept that also does need to keep ourselves in check, that there's a structure around how colonization advanced and evolved ahead, as well as the fact that in spite of lines on a map, there are many places where borders don't really exist in the same way that is thought about generally in terms of the passage. And it's really important of looking especially at Africa and Asia in terms of the legacy of colonialism in terms of where that sits. Case in point is just being able to look at what happened after 1955 with the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, where 29 countries started the pathway of looking at what a post-colonial world looks like in terms of maps. So you can see the map of Africa. Most of the colonial lines were drawn in late 19th in red and early 20th in blue. And perhaps too much detail for this conversation, but countries continue to be created and stood up and stood down in terms of just the way things evolve beyond just the name. as well. So in 2009 in Sudan, for example. But the Bandung Conference also established around what it is advanced in both Africa and Asia, the aspects of, well, what next for the post-colonial period. And in Asia, we see a lot more from the 19th century in red and similarly in blue in terms of lines that are drawn. So 1904 between Thailand and Laos, you can see where that boundary evolved. The context for borders in terms of Andrew Kuhnberg's work has also looks at some other geographies, including where I reside in Vancouver between Canada and the United States, of the world's largest undefended border, generally speaking, along the red line on the 49th parallel. But you can see a lot of geographies well below the 49th parallel in terms of 18th century decision making, among other aspects. In terms of what is termed the U.S.-Canada border, in terms of the length of being able to deal with the boundary between Canada and the United States as both countries evolved over time. In terms of the eastward movement to the west, one of the things I do speak quite often as well in terms of both where folks in Victoria sit as well as in Vancouver. We are on Coast Salish territory. So before the line in 1846, there are unceded territories for which there was free movement for First Nations, moving from Seattle up to Vancouver and beyond, that are part of the same population in terms of historic trading patterns. So we also need to regard the complexity of borders is beyond some of the aspects that are put forward, and some of the other things that you're going to hear about in terms of indigenous Arctic border aspect later on in a different session. The other aspect this is a fun experiment given our global audience is there's a long history of the relationship between military and borders, geography, lines on a map. Now, in terms of the way technology works, it's definitely worth exploring based on where you actually look at maps in terms of the answer coming back may be different. I think we had one person here from India. What you surf for on Google Maps in terms of an IP address in India for a map of different geographies can be different. So here's another view in terms of a completely different result, just based on how Google returns results for the same geography. And just given border disputes that invariably occur, those are some things to think about as you actually get into the topic of how borders are actually managed, especially in an air context. And so some of the questions you need to be asking is the entire set of maps that I just showed you in terms of going all the way back to the 13th century for the oldest remaining border to now. The concept of borders continues to be physical, but is it? Border walls and border checkpoints are visuals we typically think about, and we do have a number of demilitarized zones. But for airports, this is also quite a unique construct because many places have airports that are far away from the physical boundaries. So international airspace and waters have a distinct meaning in terms of rule sets, as well as we've seen with the conflict in terms of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the resulting aspects of the polar air routes not being able to be used. Those are some aspects that are quite complex, but it's really a question we should be asking when we're thinking about air borders. Is you may have a place like Edmonton that is quite inland in Canada, or Chengdu in the middle of China, for example, that may be an international boundary far inside the territorial map. Where the border is a really good question, But when the border process occurs is also an important question to ask when you're dealing with air travel. We also have to think about the airport role in supply chains. There are a number of folks, and just coming off of hearing from World Customs Organization earlier today, there's an aspect around supply chains. This is an image of a Boeing aircraft in terms of where all the different parts come from. So in green, you could have from the wings from Oklahoma and Japan. You can have fuselage in the front from Wichita, Kansas, mid-forward fuselage from Japan, Italy, center fuselage. So almost as many geographies represented for participants in today's session as there are manufacturers. And so that does also create some aspects for a couple of terms that have come up in the past couple of years and gained prominence. Offshoring in terms of the past 20, 30 years of moving production to less expensive labor environments, nearshoring, which is very much a reversal of some of those aspects in terms of finding close-in production areas, friendshoring as far as trade deals for regional blocks of countries. Those are some things that as the pendulum shifts back and forth from those who are looking for global free trade to countries that are increasingly protectionist about their economic interests, those are some aspects that will have a pendulum back and forward. And I go back to my earlier comment. You have a change in the UK government. Guess what? You have a number of countries lining up to set up a new deal with the new administration or party ruling the UK. Those are some examples of things to look at, as well as the aftermath of the Brexit decision. The airport role in supply chains is thus as a conduit for some of these major changes. And without diving into too much detail on this one aspect, but happy to elaborate a bit more. There's an extended concept of you have conventionally thought about for air cargo, a freighter aircraft in terms of carrying goods to and from different destinations. But the vast majority of air cargo still is on the belly space of passenger aircraft. And that itself is a role towards high value, lightweight goods that move back and forward. And in the case of manufacturing, a lot will go by train where possible, maritime. But when you get into manufacturing for just-in-time production, it is quite common for parts to move by air, especially when you need to keep a plant operational and moving forward if warehousing doesn't store enough things that are shown in this very complicated diagram for where all the different parts sit. So I'm going to move into the next segment around just looking at border risks. And this is something, especially for folks in the group who are practitioners. And I think I heard somebody coming in from the intelligence side of things, that many of you will have undoubtedly viewpoints in practice. But I've narrowed this down to 6 key areas of risk management in terms of the average country deals with immigration, customs, ag quarantine, health, security slash policing, and that can be quite variable about an individual country's definition of national security versus criminality of intercepting folks on an Interpol warrant on the policing side of things, and then other that may be specific to an individual state in terms of decision making. And so when I use the term for ICAO for standards and recommended practices as it pertains to civil aviation, there are some aspects that touch upon not necessarily the specificity of what happens in customs or immigration. Certainly, bodies like World Customs Organization will provide some of the standards between states, but the overall collection of what does an airline specifically do versus an airport versus a government entity or otherwise. And so I'll run through these one by one in terms of just the basics. Um, Examples of threats from an immigration perspective: false identity, major campaigns right now on human smuggling, unauthorized entry to a country, or fraudulent visa visit purpose, as well as the extended aspect on visa overstays. Visa overstays in terms of a number of countries managing an exit entry record. Those are some aspects that are some of the common threats. The issues, though, on immigration is the vast majority of travel is legitimate. But we also have an issue where there are a billion humans with no primary documents. A funny personal story. My wife's family were asylum seekers from Vietnam. And later on, when we were getting married, we were asked, "Oh, where's your primary document for your wife?" Well, guess what? When leaving Vietnam during war, you're not going to necessarily be able to get to primary documents in terms of collecting that and making sure that it's put in place. And then a third bullet point on issues, and this is very topical in terms of viewpoints from countries on whether they are or not welcoming for asylum seekers. And that pendulum is definitely going back and forth and back and forth in terms of different political viewpoints. And then lastly, the rapid changes in smuggling patterns, which are some of the things on immigration in particular that need to be managed. And so the second aspect typically you'll find is customs in terms of contraband and drugs, import, export. And for those who are managing customs as well, know that invariably deals with collection of duties as well as some of the other aspects around quantities and what can be advanced in terms of exports and imports. IP theft is continuing to be a great issue to manage, in addition to the influence that I've got on the right hand side in terms of where e-commerce is advanced to. Last 2 points: antiquities and exotic animals. Those are aspects for which the preservation of movement of artwork and other aspects that are related to an individual country. Those are things that are customs issues that countries typically deal with. On the right-hand side, growth of e-commerce, and it varies in different sectors, just based on an individual country's move towards business to consumer or business to business e-commerce. That aspect around how do you deal with de minimis rules, as well as the aspects around data aspects that I'm sure you've gotten from an earlier session in huge quantity of information. But that's one of the drivers as well that's quite challenging. I mentioned earlier protectionist free trade shifts and the pendulum that may have those who are against global free trade, those are for free trade, or perhaps more near term in terms of a number of folks have written about groups of countries that may be aligned in terms of a free trade region, whether it's across the Pacific, within Europe itself, or with Canada, US, Mexico as examples. Tariffs, taxes, and duties, the sophistication of smuggling patterns and illegal wildlife trade. Those are some aspects we can definitely dive into a greater degree of detail But the last two, sophistication of smuggling and illegal wildlife trade, the Buckingham Palace Declaration on Illegal Wildlife Trade is a good place to look at around international commitments so that live animals or parts of animals are trafficked and can be quite problematic from a sustainability standpoint, especially for invasive species. So those are some things that may also overlap with the quarantine health ag end of things as well. A number of different jurisdictions will deal with immigration and customs separately. Canada, the United States, UK, Australia have combined forces that have a multi-mandate group like folks from CBSA on this call for Canada Border Services Agency. Agriculture and quarantine is a third area that you will commonly find, especially for countries, pick New Zealand, Australia as examples, who are quite sensitive to invasive species or food loss to pests. Those are aspects that are estimates from the Food and Agriculture Organization that with the amount of food loss to pests, that food security could be partially answered if we didn't have that amount of spread of pests that are taking that volume of food out of the supply side of things. Distribution to those places on Earth that actually need food, that's obviously a different story as well. From a quality of food standpoint, a lot more in terms of if you are claiming that a certain product on the agriculture side of things is truly organic, how do you really know that? And what are some of the aspects that are put in place there, especially around I'm going to pick on a substance, honey. Honey is one where there may be a residue level within the quality of the food that does not meet a country's specification. And that is certainly a regulated aspect for a number of countries like Japan, South Korea, for which the residue level in a food is one that could actually deny importing into a geography. That's an example at a micro level, but gives you a sense of just the range of different considerations. I didn't hear anybody on this call specifically focused on agriculture in terms of the intros, but it is a completely different language and arguably lack of global standards that are issues depending on the commodity you're dealing with, of course. And then lastly, I spend a little bit of time on animal-specific diseases in terms of not being able to have that spread through. On the right-hand side of things, there are three core issues: food, water, security, touched on. Pre-departure screening is something that is growing more in terms of the agricultural world, meaning if you have a veterinarian or a ag specialist do certifications before an export that may or may not meet import requirements, there's a thought process, well, why send something all the way across an ocean to a foreign country to get rejected for import when you can actually do that before departures? At the same time, you have to trust that a screening, and screening not necessarily in a mechanized format, it may be sampling or other kinds of technology that may be able to offer risk management that meets a destination country. But that can only take place if there are auditable global standards that you can actually trust what an originating country is actually sending to a destination country. And that aspect is one that is still not as mature as other aspects of customs in terms of just the overall global norms. Security and policing, and especially after 9/11, there was a lot of mixture of thought processes around what happens in aviation security, national security, and border security. Those are aspects that we've had a fairly long time since 9/11, 23 odd years ago, in terms of just how the maturation of unlawful interference in aviation is actually managed and related. So earlier, I started with highlighting the 75th anniversary of ICAO Annex 9. Well, the International Civil Aviation Organization also has a separate Annex 17 covering aviation security that deals with terrorism as well. Lastly, the transnational crime and parental disputes movement of children, many cases that you've probably seen or heard about in terms of custody battles between divorced parents and whether children are caught up in being able to move from point A to B that has the permission of the second parent. The issues on this aspect and understanding security and policing is a fairly wide array of different topics. Is what are some of the standards for screening that still are quite difficult that I'll elaborate on in a different section of this presentation around how aviation security has evolved and the amount of attention spent on screening objects versus security, which is a bit more expansive in terms of the broader topic of not just unlawful interference in aviation, but the broader aspect of whether your airport that you're dealing with for international travel has enough defensive mechanisms to deal with potential threats. How intelligence actually works in terms of actionable intelligence shared at a broad level, a threat context statement, as well as the actual execution of how do you actually ensure your stakeholder community is actually aware of some of the different aspects. When you look at the literature on the role of aviation security and border security, how they intersect, it's the degree to which your domain in the airport's environment have a culture associated with ensuring intelligence is communicated at the right level of information at the right time, and you have a stakeholder environment that is has the inbuilt mechanisms. There are different views on this, but a term called security management systems, SEMS, SEMS, is one aspect that is advancing ahead around developing a culture of sharing actionable intelligence within an airport environment that deals with the fact that uh, most people working at an airport are actually not employed by an airport itself. You have a wide array of groups associated with ground handlers, food folks, baggage handlers, airlines, government agencies, among other aspects. The issue here on the security policing front from a border perspective is internal conspiracies within the airport environment is significant around just where we see um, the actual plots from a criminal perspective, especially when there's knowledge of high valuable items coming through from a cargo perspective. The theft of a large quantity of gold bricks in Toronto, for example, last year is one example of some of the aspects that can happen in terms of dealing with the criminal aspects. And then last but not least, slightly different views of crime that are not universal in terms of going across different boundaries. We think we have, through the narrative of the amount of effort spent during the COVID-19 pandemic, um, gotten a bit further ahead in terms of some of the thinking on the health side of things. But this is an aspect that is still evolving. And of course, the global spread of disease during flights is not a new thing from from COVID-19 itself, and the ability for pandemics to be cutting across borders is something that whether you were around working on SARS in 2003, Zika virus, among others, those are things that have been epidemics and pandemics that have occurred over the years in terms of World Health Organization guidance. The one aspect, though, we have moved away from is a lot of physical vaccination records. But we also have a fascinating issue happening this month that I'll touch on later in terms of a US Center for Disease Control ruling on dogs going across the US border, whether it's land, air, or otherwise, in terms of new documentation requirements and chips on the dogs. So those are some aspects of that we need to think about health as it pertains to individuals in terms of passengers. But in the case of what has disability advocates quite anxious is that the new rule set put forward by US CDC kind of forgot to deal with the fact that a number of dogs are service animals that are absolutely necessary for an international traveler requiring a service animal for which the amount of time for implementation is not is unlikely for August this year. But those are things that will go up and down in terms of just a country's interest. So I go back to the generic diagram of color blocks, and an individual country may not have as much of a concern from a threat risk environment for immigration or health and have a huge amount on security policing. Other countries may have a dominant concern around immigration and less for others. So one of the key concepts I wanted to also lay out is that an individual country may have a completely different view of the relative weight of risk management as it pertains to different threats that may be faced by border officials. So the aspect around evolving air borders is one that has to contextualize around what are the dominant issues that a country faces. What empirical evidence is there that demonstrates the level of threat risk management? So I'm going to move on to the next section associated with some of the aspects of, are we trying to look for a needle in a haystack? So when we look at the range of different potential threats and my very cursory outline of threats and issues for each of these areas, how do we actually interdict and work on this from an air border perspective? The number one difficulty in the commercial air environment is time. Time in terms of how long it takes to actually accomplish some of the different kinds of processes. In September 2022, I enjoyed a 3-hour lineup at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport to get through security screening. Time is a factor that not everybody has, just because everybody would have been delayed for flights going out that particular day. But there are other examples associated with the aerodynamic on connectivity, as well as how do you have an acceptable risk that is looked at and sampled around the effectiveness of the system. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I brought forward a number of things from the past. So in the 18th century, during the plague, and this is I think we have at least one Italian speaker here, but the health document back in 1722 would have been a piece of paper that says, hey, we're free of disease, thanks to God. This person's leaving with name, height, kind of thing. So fundamentally speaking, for whatever proof of vaccination method your country may or may not have had, that was really not too different than the right-hand side in terms of typically a country would have put a QR code system in place or a physical piece of paper like the US vaccination record card in white and the UK NHS version on the right-hand side. And so it's important to look at the devices, and the techniques have largely been unchanged, although the container may be different now with an electronic methodology. The risk map in terms of the temporal aspect. So remembering my comments around lines in a map. So you've got a map up as well. A good resource to always look at is uh, what kinds of threats are advanced. Our friends in insurance, such as Aon, a company on global insurance, publishes regularly a viewpoint on terrorism and political violence that rates each country associated with a 5-point scale. And these are updated because while you will think of one thing 1 year, like think about the United States 5 years ago versus now in terms of political violence. Like that's a fundamentally different view we may have, and those things will change over time. So I may look back at this as well in terms of what Aon says, but there's empirical evidence around where insurance brokers point to some of these kinds of things. There's also an aspect around just ensuring we've got different aspects of managing risks. So what's highlighted here in terms of if you have a high risk for each of the areas in the previous section and a high likelihood, that's going to point you to a different kind of solution in place in terms of what needs to be looked at, and prioritizing that over a low likelihood and a low impact. And risk assessment and measures are typically described as having three key aspects. You need to have people, solutions, process, and technology. As I mentioned at the start, I do have a long history working in different technologies. In the late 1990s, I was working on a lot of trusted traveler programs in biometrics. And no matter how good a piece of technology is in managing air borders, where it falls apart in terms of thinking is if there is no regard for the people side of things, meaning we don't think about the air passenger in terms of human factors for the use of a piece of technology, or if you have, as many of you probably have, large staffed uniformed workforce for those who are managing a border force in terms of people, if you don't think about officers and what they actually do with a piece of technology, then things can fall apart. And then lastly, process, the ability to actually get the right marriage of how people and technology work together. Those are some of the aspects that are important when you go from looking at air border risks. In the pre-read as well, there's a paper I wrote with Nina Brooks on evolving risk-based security in terms of a viewpoint some 9-10 years ago, in terms of some of the things on how do you deal with this in the air transport environment, and in looking at mechanisms, we have a long echo in risk management models from pre-board screening in the late 60s. Excuse me a sec, I gotta, excuse me. From the late 1960s, early 70s, in terms of adding pre-board screening, in terms of measures, all the way to dealing with full body scanning, there's certainly an environment that will be important to advance ahead. It's also just the level of risk management that's applied. So the slide that we were looking at was evolving risk-based security. And that aspect in terms of the narrative going from the 1960s to be able to look at the threat for the day. So if you were having this conversation back in the late 1960s, the dominant aspect was hijackings, going in terms of security measures, all the way to current day issues that are still very much tied to the level of liquids, aerosols, and gels as potential explosives. So those kinds of restrictions came in 2006 and are still dominant, associated with where we see the different aspects. But what's critical in terms of the environment of looking at air border risks is what you're looking at is a slide of a journey from Athens to Heathrow to different points in the United States. An important aspect for border management is how that works with a hub such as Heathrow, LHR, in terms of the acronym for the airport. And that's really how much time do you have to deal with additional processes before a passenger is bound for the Heathrow to United States leg. In Athens, passengers are security screened. We do the same as far as different processes in Heathrow potentially. And then finally, are they accepted on arrival to the United States in terms of, let's say in Chicago, a passenger may make a final connection to go to South Dakota as an example. And that type of journey is one where I mentioned at the start, we need to think about borders not just as a physical line in the sand, but also think about it from a timing perspective. Is the connection 60 minutes? Is the connection 90 minutes or otherwise? Last month, I had a connection through Frankfurt that theoretically had 3 hours before my journey back to Canada. The flight left late, and so I was reduced to 40 minutes instead of 3 hours. So the ability for the same processes, including walking time, to be put in place at an airport hub. Those are some of the things that are going to be considerations when setting up different planning parameters, whether it's operations or facilities at a hub airport. Not all airports are hubs. So, for example, if you're having this conversation around Punta Cana Airport in the Dominican Republic, that will be more a holiday destination. So, nobody really connects a huge amount to go through Punta Cana. You're either going there for holiday making or otherwise in terms of an origin destination. So, knowing the kinds of aspects before you have a conversation around how to evolve borders is a topic that's important to consider. So what do you do with that amount of time? So border controls at airports can vary a great degree. What you're looking at is a picture from 1952 Honolulu Airport. And what you see is a process that may not be fundamentally different in terms of people lining up to go to a booth for a passport check. But that has obviously changed over time in terms of available technologies. One of the things that few people think about now is what does the word passport mean in terms of its terminology to pass a port in terms of its origins. Well, in the entire narrative of the International Civil Aviation Organization, and this year being the 75th anniversary of the original document for Annex 9, we only have a history dating back to the 1980s for the passport actually being standardized across countries on this planet. And it's fascinating just because It was only in the 1980s that ICAO's document 9303 created the standard for what you see on the right-hand side for a Canadian passport in other countries around the world. And over time, that has only changed in terms of any time a global standards document has been updated to add a chip, add a biometric. And on the left-hand side is a picture from Iceland Airport in terms of just that comparison to the earlier Honolulu picture, where you're still, for the large part of control, dealing with going up to an officer, unless airports, together with government authorities, start putting in other automated solutions such as gates. And so that continuum and what you're looking at here is a generic diagram of the inside part of an airport. So the ability from the left-hand side for passengers who may be from a train station or city or home going to an airport and then going through every part of the process, typically and generically: landside retail, check-in, passport control, security, and then airside retail. And this passport control aspect may be quite variable, given not every country has an exit process for checking passports. That might be part of what airlines actually do in terms of making sure the destination country or outbound immigration protocols are advanced. And so when you look at the journey map, the typical aspect of boiling down the air border process is a number of different steps, 8 in terms of the departure process. You can book a flight up to 365 days in advance in terms of a journey. So by this time in July 2025, you can actually put money down and purchase a ticket. Somewhere during that time is step 2 for travel authorizations, and that may be a variety of different things, perhaps a little bit less so for health, but definitely visa or travel authorization are 2 of the more common things that will be in place. And then when passengers get into the airport, it is a check-in environment where that may take place at an airport or may take place with a smartphone device. Step 4, if passengers have a checked bag, that's where the bag drop is, and potentially outbound border control. That may be an aspect associated typically with checking immigration documents if a country has outbound immigration controls. Step 6, security screening, and in parallel with that, the baggage screening will take place after the bag drop from step 4 in terms of the journey for passengers' bags below the hold. There may be travel retail, which isn't really a step itself, and on the way to boarding an international flight. On the bottom are the steps typically in the journey map for inbound controls associated with the ability for a destination country. So imagine everything you see up here, step 1 to 8 is from the earlier map from Greece. In red is Heathrow in terms of inbound control, step 9, potentially baggage claim, exit from the bag haul, and you're either connecting to air or other modes or arriving in the UK as some of the possibilities. There's some variation here in that a number of places may have a direct pathway to connect to air without going into the bag haul, but those are some aspects that may vary from country to country. So the journey map you see here is really around some of the things that a typical airport will have. To tie that to the earlier discussion, the opportunities to deal with different forms of international border risks, all the different points can have a role to provide a government agency or and a group acting on behalf of government to get information, do screening, do other kinds of things that will help with the ability to provide interdiction for a risk. So let's pick a current day example. The United States Center for Disease Control idea for a certification for a dog. The earlier example I said, there's a new set of requirements coming up next month that have been proposed that will require even guide dogs for passengers with reduced mobility to have an attestation that there's a chip inside the dog, a photograph, and a certification. In that case, the border risk is stated as the United States is fearful of rabies being spread across borders. They have elected in the rulemaking to make the airline check that at check-in in terms of a form or deny boarding for the dog. What has airports really quite anxious is if dogs are denied boarding, what exactly happens to our canine friend in terms of presumably a passenger can't just leave the dog there in the airport and some of those kinds of details on implementation. But I digress from that example, but it just shows you how a specific border threat from the earlier set of immigration, customs, ag health, security slash law enforcement. There are different points that are typically found in this journey map at an airport to be able to deal with different issues as they may arise. So in looking at this in terms of just the narrative of how do you evolve borders, historically airports have been primarily the places for immigration checks. So passport, how do you pass a port with a passport? That's an immigration check. But there may be an additional focus typically for arrivals in terms of dealing with customs and agricultural issues. Certain countries have outbound controls in place in terms of dealing with outbound migration issues. And those are aspects around some of the things that are illegal wildlife trade driven, that may be spot inspections or other export controls, such as electronics that cannot be exported to certain countries from the United States, or other rule sets that may be put in place. There may be outbound controls dealing with detecting human smuggling. One of the folks that I spoke with recently specialize in human smuggling have highlighted that the airport washroom is the main place to interdict potential human smuggling activity, because it is generally the lone place where an individual who's being smuggled is alone, and that's where a lot of the focus for the helpline or what to do are focused in terms of some of those kinds of collaborative efforts between different parties. And then last example of movement of quantities of currency. Those are some aspects and examples of outbound controls that are in place in terms of dealing with that on exit from a country. But there's also an aspect about when you actually deal with processing. The vast majority of a lot of the processing is from a arrival standpoint, but there's also an evolution of pre-clearance in terms of full border clearance before departures rather than an arrivals process. Now, when you say the word pre-clearance, and I'm going to run through this from the US context, it's sometimes perceived of as a US specific idea, but the actual evolution of current day pre-clearance dates from before World War II when the UK and France wanted to deal with air travel between both countries in terms of stationing French officers in London, UK officers in Paris, as an example, which was the current genesis of where the model of staffing operations before departures in a foreign country comes from. U.S. preclearance in its current form started in 1952, but there's also different families of airport processing. In the 1990s, Australia initiated advanced passenger processing, which provided the ability for an electronic signal tied to visas associated with the ability to send a signal board, no board. So advanced passenger processing, when it was designed, was you were checking in Singapore rather than flying all the way from Singapore to Australia. Signal would be sent from Australian officials to the boarding process in Singapore. Um, is the individual clear to enter Australia or not? If not, then the individual wouldn't board the flight. So the 1990s version has evolved into some of the protocols that we have a number of countries put in place in terms of electronic authorizations, board, no board protocols. And then last but not least, there are next generation solutions for pre-departure imaging and biometrics. So let me talk a little bit about each so that you've got a narrative of one of the key areas of how pre-clearance is evolving. What you're looking at is Toronto Pearson, then known as Malton Field, in January 1952. This is a bit after what I mentioned about the London Paris ideas pre-World War II from the precursors of British Airways. But in this case, it was American Airlines who pushed ahead this idea. So on the left-hand side are two individuals, C.R. Smith, the head of American Airlines, and Stuart Tipton with U.S. Air Travel Association. Both pushed ahead 1950, 1951 to ask Congress for the ability to station U.S. officers in Toronto. Their issue at the time is American Airlines wanted to get to LaGuardia in Boston for flights from Toronto, but could not get officers in Boston nor New York LaGuardia to be staffed. So C.R. Smith and Stuart Tipton both pushed for a test for pre-clearance at Toronto Malton Field, and that's where the idea of the U.S. program evolved to station U.S. officers on Canadian soil. Fascinating bit of history in terms of the genesis that soon moved to Montreal. So what you're looking at now is a picture from the 60s, 1967, of Montreal Airport. It's not the clearest picture, but my arrow here is the location of the U.S. officer at Air Canada check-in in Montreal, where the idea was you would check in and then move to drop off a bag, and there would be a U.S. officer standing there who had the ability to question the passenger before the bag went through. So that was the 1960s model, which clearly was not a lot of space to do some of the border clearance duties. The U.S. program has now expanded to 15 sites around the world, including Canada, the Caribbean, Abu Dhabi, Ireland for Dublin and Shannon. And that's through the 70s, it got to Canada and Caribbean. But there was a major dispute in 1973, and it's almost unimaginable now in terms of the scenario that was advanced ahead. In 1973, the The dispute occurred because Canada was dissatisfied with air bilateral rights in terms of Canadian flag carriers. So back in 1973, you could not, as a Canadian carrier like Air Canada, legally fly from Edmonton or Calgary into the United States. It was only served by US carriers for those two cities. So the answer in 1973 was the elder Prime Minister Trudeau, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, together with the Minister of Transport Marchand at the time, issued 30 days notice for all US officers to leave Canada. So the reason I say it's unimaginable now in terms of that's not the current version of Canada we have, let alone issuing eviction orders for US officers in terms of an established program. But that was what created the 1974 agreement that would evolve in terms of then accelerating the program from the 1974 agreement into other cities and what I described as the current map now of having Abu Dhabi join in terms of the 15 sites. There are more that have occurred in terms of the more recent agreement that are not related to air. So Prince Rupert, as well as a rail cruise station in Vancouver, those are also expanded with the 2015 agreement. There may be some additional plans to grow sites, namely another airport in Canada, Toronto City Centre, Billy Bishop Airport, separate from Toronto Pearson, has plans underway, as has Brussels, Amsterdam, Schiphol, as well as other centers. So the evolution from a Canada-US perspective is really one of going from a rail model and maritime in the 19th century. I didn't mention that earlier, but there was an earlier model. 1952 to 74, it was pretty well much free flowing in terms of, as I showed the picture earlier from Montreal in the 60s, you just had a US officer standing next to check-in. The dispute gave rise to the first agreement in 1974. We have the second agreement in 2001, third agreement in 2015 that includes other modes of transportation. And then we've got additional sites. I've got a missing word here, but there are additional sites being advanced, including expansion to Brussels, Amsterdam, possibly Punta Cana, possibly Colombia, but the United States has not fully fleshed out some of its expansion plans outside Canada. Most notably, the model is being replicated elsewhere. So Hong Kong has a rail station in terms of a high-speed rail to Guangzhou. The model for Chinese officials to be stationed at the train station in Hong Kong itself. Hong Kong being unique around being a special administrative region, but matters associated with mobility from Hong Kong SAR up to mainland China itself does have a model where Chinese officials review passengers in Hong Kong before getting on the train. It's a carbon copy of the US model. And perhaps we may see other sites expand. This is an image of Toronto Billy Bishop that has designs advanced ahead, and that may be an announcement coming soon in terms of a date for future opening, in terms of being part of the sites listed in the 2015 US-Canada agreement. We have written a lot about this subject. It's a little bit older. Reference, my math is off. It's now 72 years old in terms of preclearance. But for a study we looked at 2 years ago, we have a number of different aspects for the economic value itself. So going back to the 75th anniversary for Annex 9 for ICAO, one of the 5 objectives is on what is that economic value to as well as passenger convenience that are in place. We have different forms of pre-clearance, as I mentioned earlier. The narrative from the 1990s for Australia sees a lot on electronic aspects. Last year, Eurostar had smart check biometric gates put in place associated with what you're looking at as a picture. I think this is St. Pancras Station of being able to provide that e-gates in terms of relationship of travel before getting on the train. And there may well be some other aspects that are going to leverage biometric capabilities across airports. We have the ability associated with how we actually see biometrics in place. And taking a look at Gustavo's question, thanks for that. And by all means, we welcome questions as we go along in terms of pasting them in the chat window. I'll stop in a couple of seconds before the next segment to open it up to questions, if any, from the floor. So the question Gustavo typed is, what is the issue to expand U.S. pre-clearance? Cost, agreement. So definitely yes to all of the above in terms of cost. So let's deal with the easier one. There needs to be a formal bilateral agreement between countries. So let's say you're the government of Colombia and you have started negotiations with the United States on a pre-clearance agreement. It is an actual treaty document between countries that governs the ability for a foreign officer to administer the laws of one country physically in the other country. This may vary a great degree, country by country, associated with viewpoints on civil liberties. So, in the case of Canada, for example, it is absolutely an issue around what happens in terms of a foreign officer, a U.S. officer questioning a passenger. Is there the ability to respect the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for example, in terms of due process if there is an issue associated with the interview? So some of those aspects are complicated in terms of agreements, in terms of different things countries need to decide. I perhaps am too US focused on this given the size of the US program, but it is typically a reciprocal arrangement. So most agreements the US has signed have a reciprocity that enables the other country that is a host country, it's like Canada, for example. So there are provisions for Canadian officers to be on US soil performing CBSA duties northbound, for example. And CBSA put forward some rulemaking in December 2023 to that effect on reciprocity. Cost is a major issue. A typical U.S. officer is a full officer, including living, tuition allowance, among other kinds of foreign posting. It's about 450,000 US dollars per year per officer. So that's an aspect that may increase for higher cost centers like London, England. But that itself, the United States government has been clear that it expects somebody other than the US government to pay for those costs. Is it a per passenger ticket to pay for those officer costs? Is it a tourism group that pays for it? Those are some aspects that could provide a little bit of a gap around the business case. So in the case of, I'm just going to move also to Humberto's question as well. In the case of the business case, if you don't have enough volume to be gained for new traffic, it's hard to look at the US program seriously, just because it could be extremely expensive to maintain, let alone the facilities that need to be segregated. Second question in the chat window, Umberto asks, in Peru, the Jorge Chavez International Airport is under the administration of a concessionaire company, so a private-public partnership. It's not run by government. So one of the problems is associated with privacy. So selected customs officials utilize APIS, but not PNR. That's fascinating. Um, so in big round numbers, APIS being a select field of information, typically first name, last name, passport information, a limited set of 6 to 8 fields, PNR being 20 some odd fields, possibly, if not greater, in terms of just the type of PNR. So the question is also, I've always heard that airlines operating at the airport will never share passengers' information, thus it's impossible to implement PNR unless customs has more power at the airport. How can you deal with this from a customs perspective, given the need for proper risk management to combat transnational crime? So that's a really good question around. I think you're absolutely right in that an airport may not necessarily have anything to do with getting that information when you're thinking about European GDPR rules, among other kinds of things. It can be quite difficult around whether a party like an airport would actually have access to that information. Typically not. You'd sooner have an airline have the information because it's the manifest information. So the question then is really one about what are we trying to do with the PNR information to be able to judge customs risks or immigration risks. Um, an airport may be just confined to a black box that enables a 1 or 0 in terms of the result of that type of thing, or information about whether a passenger is going to a connecting flight or not. Some of those aspects around the PNR aspect may also be a bit more dated from late 1990s thinking, just because the algorithms for PNR to actually deal with pattern matching in terms of travel patterns, there's still value, but that may be diminishing to actual X-ray images of bag imagery that may be shared between countries, which segues into Paulo's question in Western Europe, techniques of non-invasive controls of luggage tied to BHS are going to be applied not only in airports, but other means of transportation, cross-border cable car. What is the opinion and what about Canada? I think it's absolutely an interesting question that I am fixated in this presentation on the air border, but I think we need to look at air to train connectivity as a journey type. In the United States, there are very good examples of a more localized air to commercial bus type of environment, as well as Orlando has a lot of cruise ship facilitation, as we have in Vancouver in terms of intermodal journeys. So I think it's also one where the quick answer to Paula's question is there is a lot more being done for X-ray image sharing, but it's starting with London Heathrow to 6 points in the United States for something called one-stop security, which enables baggage image, X-ray images to be sent ahead of time for before a flight takes off in London, and it's shared through the journey in terms of potential other connections by air or air to other modes. That is a pilot project for 60 years that Congress has approved in the United States, and there are some aspects that will grow further. Um, Last question before I go back into the presentation. Onome is asking a question. What can you tell us about the bordering of airspace over time and the closing and opening of such air borders during periods of war or terrorism? So I think there are a couple of different answers to that. With the aviation safety aspects, and this unfortunately centers on the downing of passenger aircraft in conflict zones. Think Iran, think Ukraine, before our current conflict in terms of passenger aircraft that unfortunately have been down. So there are very important safety reasons that we want to avoid a potential civilian aircraft from being shot down during a conflict zone. So we understand that aspect. But I think here we have a significant aeropolitical issue where the um, a good example here is the let's say China to US air transport. Russia has said to US carriers, you are not welcome at all over polar air routes. But Chinese flag carriers are, because China and Russia don't have that issue. So there's an economic aspect around, is a Chinese carrier unfairly advantaged in terms of being able to serve a route that a US flag carrier can't? And these are some aspects around the reasons why rule sets are advanced and the closing and opening of airspace access that gets into some of the geopolitical problems I highlighted. So it's a very, very good question around being able to monitor that aspect, especially as the way countries are behaving towards each other, with the United States and China being the top two aviation markets on the planet, with considerable influence about how long it will take to solve these kinds of issues in terms of sovereignty of airspace. I will come back to additional questions before our practicum, but we'll move back into the PowerPoint deck now. So one of the areas of considerable activity right now pertains to biometrics at airports. So I know some of our questions centered on imagery, on baggage handling system and otherwise, but identity in terms of how it's used is also an evolving aspect. One area that may be also quite specific to geographies like the United States, where the number of people with a travel passport right now is still fairly low, but mobile driver's licenses in terms of Apple or Android for a driver's license as a form of identity, Apple has started moving that with Android for Google and Samsung to be in the smartphone itself. So for those who have a smartphone, that may also start to become an all-in-one device for identity management as one of the things that is shifting in this space. At a basic level, as you may be aware, biometrics is just the ability to use a mathematical algorithm. DNA theoretically could be one, although it takes too long for the recognition, whereas facial and finger are the ones that ICAO has put in as part of the standards for what appears in the passport. For illustrative purposes, the algorithm is just a mathematical formula tied to a device such as a reader or the smartphone piece I was talking about, the driver's licenses, to be able to confirm an identity. There is an aspect around it may take too long, and I referred to my 3-hour lineup in Schiphol, and this was the picture there. So at the front of the line, there's somebody who fumbles and looks at identity documents. That can take 5 seconds per passenger, but for folks who may have the wrong page open, because it's kind of hard to magically get your passport right to the picture photo page, or if there is a reader for an e-passport that may not be necessarily quite as quick to read. Some of those kinds of things in queuing theory is, if you eliminate 5 seconds per passenger, you can actually carve out a huge amount of multiplication of lineup and potentially staff time just to speed up identity checks as a basic methodology. The other aspect of this is The reciprocity is one that is I mentioned earlier in terms of how you actually work with a technology system for biometrics or the system for pre-clearance. These are aspects for which there may be a lot more of those kinds of activities. So the article on the left-hand side talks about the Canadian model going into have reciprocity on pre-clearance for the first time since the 1974 agreement. You have the Hawaii governor actively pushing for pre-clearance from Japan to the United States. And then last but not least, we should not ignore the role of pre-screening or pre-clearance, such as the UPS trial with Canada Border Services Agency from Denmark to Canada in terms of the use of screening imagery ahead of a time. So that's a purely air cargo aspect. But whether your cargo or your biometrics, this was something I took a week ago at Toronto Pearson Airport in terms of a biometric system that you can just go into a store. I took my Excel gum off of the shelf. I didn't see a single staff person. I walked out and magically my credit card was charged. And some of those kinds of systems is still debatable about full consumer acceptance. This is an Amazon technology in the background for this store at Toronto Pearson. But it's something to think about in terms of just the kinds of shifts. I think from a border management or security management point of view, there are some clear benefits around touchless identity verification, meaning that example I showed of the 3 hour lineup at Schiphol, that could be one of the solutions for faster aspects. There's a lot more that you can say about safety and security associated with fidelity of document checks. So can an airline agent looking at a passport truly tell you about a fraudulent identity? That's debatable, but biometrics can actually provide a greater degree of fidelity. Third point, the seamless passenger journey. I'm glad that there were questions about intermodal journeys because there is a narrative around air to cruise, air to other modes for which the seamless passenger journey does stop thinking about air as the only part of the journey. It's actually not not the case. And there's a lot of thinking about can we use the same identity management across the entire journey as a way of getting to faster processing. And so what does this look like in future? So for airports, especially through the post-pandemic period, many of you may have been traveling during a time when the number of queues, processes at check-in, these are quite voluminous. In future, we may have more automated podia and the use of facial recognition just to be able to speed up processing and the use of airport space for check-in and bag drop. For boarding gates, this is newer in Canada and the United States. The balance of the world have had automated boarding gates for some time. But the benefits there, if implemented properly, is just the speed of boarding aircraft. The ability to board an entire wide-body aircraft in 20 minutes and not taking longer is important from a speed business case, especially for hubs. For border processes, this is just one depiction of moving from the picture I showed from Honolulu from the 50s, an older picture of Iceland, Reykjavik, Keflavik Airport, rather, in terms of the line up into a queue, and then moving into a truly new way, seamless process. It may or may not involve automated e-gates. This was the example of the Amazon-based self-checkout type of thing associated with the model for food and beverage, possibly retail. So the question then is, what next for biometrics? So we have two things that are important in terms of the Annex 9 development. So I mentioned earlier the 1980s ICAO document 9303. That was what defined the original passport global standard and now the electronic passports. Well, the same aspect in terms of ICAO defining the digital travel credential, this is for the first time providing an aspect around using a digital container that is proof positive in terms of the security of the originator of the document, as well as the ability for privacy protected user control for submitting information that I think an earlier question for API PNR may also provide a different pathway given a lot of privacy advocates as well as rule set in Japan, in Europe for GDPR, and even subnational activities like the California Consumer Protection Act put next generation privacy protections in place. So the ability of getting some of the other aspects in place. And I know we have one individual from India as well. I highlight as well that there are different national standards being in place. And so that's one of the aspects around how do we actually move ahead global adoption given the different types of ways biometrics are used, as well as the user control through self-sovereign identity. In terms of visas, we also have a mechanism that is very much tied to that funny sticker that goes inside the passports and a variety of stamping mechanisms to what I mentioned earlier for advanced passenger processing, as well as new developments like the Gulf Cooperation Council sick country all-in-one visa that applies and provides some of the ability for tourism development. Those are some of the highlights around just where this has evolved to. In terms of the journey map, I think one of the questions that you need to ask, no matter where you're from, in terms of the top line, number steps 1 to 8, which is the departing airport, 9 and beyond in terms of the arriving airport, is where do you see some of the areas that may intersect additional changes that may provide to some of the passenger experience efficiencies as well as interdicting border threats. And those are some of the aspects that do require some thinking associated with this piece. So what I'm going to do at this stage is maybe just pause for other questions tied to this journey map before we move on to the last segment. If there's any questions, otherwise, are there any changes about point 6 security screening? Absolutely. Um, I oftentimes describe security screening as having a 10 to 15 year head start when you look at medical imaging. So I'll have some images about this later in terms of the evolution for that. But one of the major changes is the introduction of computed tomography screening at the checkpoint, which provides slices of different angles of images and better threat detection for explosives, and possibly a pathway towards not having to have liquids divested and removing that and putting all your liquids in small quantities in a Ziploc bag, those kinds of processes. So there may be some of the changes there. There are definitely, the second change I would highlight is there is a viewpoint that we are still looking for metallic objects. So that's why you go through a metal detector typically for screening. but that is being phased out because that's no longer the dominant threat. Knives were prominent as a threat item in the 1960s and 70s. That is not the case now. The main threat, according to ICAO on the aviation security side of things, is improvised explosive devices. So that's really the main thing that's changing in step six. Okay, so that's a good segue because the next segment deals with aviation security specifically. Before we get into our practicum exercise about the journey map and ICAO's objectives in about 15 minutes. So what you're looking at is 1930s Vancouver International Airport, and I've highlighted in red the fence line back then. So most of you may have experienced this in some shape or fashion, but it very much was before the 1960s, 70s, and into the period just after 9/11, that it was quite free in terms of different fence lines, and the different impetus for change is as a result of different incidents. So I just responded to Gustavo's question around security screening. Well, explosives are actually not a new threat. It may be the focus now, but coincidentally, 75 years ago was a plot to blow up an aircraft that was an insurance fraud issue. This was one of the aspects that highlighted some of the kinds of things that can happen in terms of plots. But the main thrust for today's system is there were 89 hijackings in 1969 alone, and through the 1970s, 41 a year. And this was the plot primarily of a metallic object, a knife threatening a cabin crew, and please take me to Cuba. That was a predominant plot in terms of 32 out of the 82 hijackings, or 89 hijackings in 1969 were destined for Cuba. But this evolved quite a bit more. A book you may want to read if you've got a deep interest in here is called The Naked Airport, where this picture is from. And it's one where in 1973, LaGuardia, you have the introduction of the walk-through metal detector. Airports were designed like bus terminals. So on the left-hand side, you're looking at a picture of Kansas City Airport, where it would be the shortest distance to go to gate. You didn't need screening. I spoke a bit about Annex 17, which is basically a companion to Annex 9, but covering security instead of border facilitation. And that's to deal with threats to aviation. Countries like Canada implemented aviation security programs by 1975, and this became a set of global norms that evolved in terms of just let's deal with metallic objects and make sure knives are not getting on aircraft. But this evolved through the 70s and 80s as the threat environment changed into much larger plots for hijackings, including some of the terrorist bombings at airports, as well as different kinds of hijacking that occurred. And that precipitated in 1985 for one of the most tragic events in Canadian history, and that was the circumstances around the Indira Gandhi's assassination, as well as the attack on the Sikh temple, which created an environment where Vancouver and New York were found to be the two centers, using today's terminology, for radicalization. So in June 1985 was the Air India A182 downing and the bombing of CP3. We don't actually talk a lot about CP3 because the aircraft actually arrived at Tokyo Narita Airport early. There were two baggage handlers killed because the bomb was unloaded early. Both bombs were loaded in Vancouver. The scenario was Somebody went up to the airline agent and said, "Hey, my uncle forgot his bags. Could you please load this up to the aircraft?" And the airline agent went ahead and loaded it. So there was a set of circumstances that Canada was forced into from 1985 to 86 to 87 to implement new security protocols focused, of course, on international travel, to which made Canada a world leader in aviation security back in that time because we were forced into that in Canada. But history would move forward in terms of a couple of major incidents shortly thereafter: the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, followed by the TWA 800 incident in 1994. And this created a question of how do you find out if an explosive is present? Vapor, particles, density are the three ways to be able to look at it. I personally find dogs extremely effective, but they're slow, and detection dogs are hard to also keep maintained and happy as far as just the ability to maintain an operation. And that's where in the 1990s, the mechanized systems for X-ray images were advanced. I mentioned incorrectly 1984. 1996 was TWA 800, which gave rise to the current thinking, followed by 9/11, that accelerated some of the aspects for investments in aviation security. These are things that you may already be quite familiar with, but I think to give you some directional aspects in relating aviation security to border risks, as I mentioned earlier, the Buckingham Declaration on Illegal Wildlife Trade. This is where we may have an intersection with the next generation of thinking. London Heathrow, together with Microsoft, had an interesting artificial intelligence pilot project that used X-ray imagery from aviation security to do pattern matching in terms of illegal wildlife trade. So pangolin is an example where the smuggling of pangolin is something that occurs in the baggage of passengers, check bags, and the bags are going through X-ray screening anyways for explosive detection. But what if algorithms that Microsoft assisted Heathrow to develop could have a library of common smuggling objects directed at baggage scanners? We're not talking about publishing any kind of imagery of the bags that people are checking in, as much as provide an alert if you see animals or animal parts in the baggage of hold baggage, to be able to launch a signal associated with potential intervention needed. That trial was successful, and that may be part of the narrative going ahead in terms of the intersection from artificial intelligence to existing machinery using software algorithm to deal with potential border threats. So I'm going to close in the next couple of minutes before our section on just a couple of trends that you need to pay attention to in this space. Number one is, I think, data analytics, exactly like the example just raised in terms of Microsoft AI's work with London Heathrow, is there is a lot more to look at on a range of different data. It could be adoption of smartphones for information input. Smartphones can better translate for any language on the planet than otherwise possible, and potentially can even do simultaneous interpretation for video interviews. There's a digital divide problem in terms of those who do not necessarily have access to smartphone technologies, but there are other aspects that can be advanced, especially with the proliferation of consumer devices for location tracking and other kinds of things that are not necessarily large data consumers. But data sharing across governments and some of the earlier comments and questions on data sharing to Peru, I think those are things that I think it's quite accurate to say the approach is not mature. I harp a little bit on the CDC move in the United States for the dog rule, but literally a completely separate PDF online web only form was put forward as opposed to using some of the protocols for data sharing that can make it easier for consumers, airlines, and others. Here's just a picture of the web form, the web only form, and just an oddity around the requirement for that's been put in place. Trend number two, global cooperation. Um, Many of you are from Europe, South America, other places. However, that mechanism in terms of cooperation and the role for the strength of the United States and China in particular for whether standards are going to actually be followed or advanced. And the challenge to a framework like ICAO Annex 9, those are some things that are perhaps beyond our topic here in terms of whether we believe global cooperation will continue in its current form. Um, but what is absolutely clear to me is there are many examples of multilateral initiatives for smaller groups of countries to cooperate together. CARICOM in the Caribbean, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, among others. And these are profound implications because these are groups of countries that will create new and emerging standards. I've referred back to the Gulf Cooperation Council visa. That's also an interesting development. Number three, I think there will be dramatic pre-clearance growth for the examples outlined for passengers, the fact that borders are not physical markers, it's a time-based type of thing. We may not be as concerned about exactly where borders are as much as when transactions occur. You can say that for passenger traffic through air as much as cargo supply chains. Privacy protected convergence. Do we have an aspect that ensures that confidentiality of data is going to be one that is preserved and user controlled? And I think the debate will still be forthcoming around how that will be advanced, as well as, well, what happens to the data after it's submitted.